Good afternoon. My name is Professor Chris Alden. I'm with the LSE Ideas, a director, as well as the Department of International Relations. Today we're here to talk about China's role in the regions, worlds apart, the Chinese playbook for engagement with its partner countries. We have a great panel here to discuss this phenomena. Just a few thoughts and words before we see another short clip. China, of course, is the phenomenon of the 21st century. It's the second largest economy, tipped to become the first soon. It's a large investor. It plays a big role in development finance, and indeed, it's even an innovator in technology. It's, in short, it's a global power of global consequence and significance. What we're hoping to do today is to focus in on one particular dimension of that significance and draw that out as a way of talking about the role of China and the larger engagement, its larger engagement across this region and beyond. So in that spirit, what I'd like us to look at is a very short video one of our colleagues has put together on China in Kenya, looking at the development finance dimension as it relates to infrastructure development, the key parts of the toolkit of China's global engagement in the world. So if we could look at that video, thanks.
Over in Kenya, the standard gauge railway opened in 2017. With a route length of 480 kilometres, the $3.8 billion high-speed railway is Kenya's largest infrastructure project since it gained independence in 1963. Construction, led by China Road and Bridge Corporation, involved building long viaducts, deep cuttings and long embankments to navigate the rugged terrain along the route. As you might expect, building a project of this scale through the stunning natural habitats that Kenya is known for has proven to be a difficult balancing act. Two sections of the railroad running through national parks faced protests from conservationists over concern that it could threaten the wildlife. In response, designers added 14 wildlife channels and elevated sections of the track. Now complete, the railway is a game changer for both trade and transportation in the region. The passenger service has cut travel time from Mombasa to Nairobi from more than 10 hours to roughly 5 hours with a $10 economy ticket. In its second year of service, the Kenyan Railway transported 1.7 million passengers, and the freight service ferried roughly 5 million tons of goods on Chinese-supplied locomotives. But once again, things have gotten messy when it comes to money. China's Exim Bank financed 90% of the projects, and now Kenya is struggling to pay back its loans. And because both of these railways are built to a Chinese standard, any major upgrades or even parts that need to be replaced will have to come from China.
Okay, thank you. And on that note, so let me ask the question that perhaps you're asking yourself: why Kenya and China, or for that matter, why Panama and China, and of course here in Serbia and China? Partly because the Chinese say that we should think of it that way. In 2015, President Xi Jinping, in addressing the 16+1 Central Europe and Eastern Europe Forum, he said, and I quote, that this is a new platform for South-South relations. It was a statement that he and officials repeated again, that the Western Balkans, Eastern Europe, are part of their understanding of what is South-South or Global South relations. So I think it behooves us as academics, scholars, and indeed policymakers to take that seriously and to think about the comparative dimensions of phenomena here, phenomena in Latin America, phenomena in Africa, and see where the commonalities are, to understand the structure of engagement and what it means for the partners. What we're going to do today is something slightly different from previous presentations, in that I've got a set of questions I'm going to ask my colleagues here, and we will pose each of the questions in sequence, first to Oscar in Kenya, to Alvaro I don't think he's in Panama now, but he's spiritually so, and my colleagues, of course, here, Vuk and Luka, on the Serbian questions. So let me start with the first of these questions, which is, Oscar, from your perspective in the case that you've examined, oh, I should say one other thing, about 5, 6, 7 minutes per response. I'm sort of move us along there. Oscar, what is China's appeal? Why did the Kenyan government turn to China? What was it about the appeal? Was it a geopolitics at play? Was it elite interests? Was it the project-specific concerns? How would you characterize your case of China-Kenya relations and the appeal of China?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everybody for joining this conversation. Good afternoon, everybody. It's some 20 minutes to 2, and I'm happy to be part of the panel. I hope you can hear me clearly from where I'm seated.
All good.
Yes, thank you very much. And just turning to the first concern of our conversation in terms of China's appeal to Kenya. And, it's interesting that actually Kenya has to be understood within the broad context of, African countries. And if we contextualize the renewed engagement at the turn of 21st century, when a majority of African countries, including Kenya, were really struggling with the infrastructural development. And so the renewed interest on the continent in Kenya was a window of opportunity for these, these particular economies, given that the traditional sources of infrastructural aid were not only dwindling, but also the traditional sources, and mainly from the Western OECD countries, were actually pulling from infrastructure. They were now going to, venture into social sectors. And so, as China saw the gap, that actually coincided with the African interest, with Kenyan interest. And so it was an attempt to, sort of diversify sources of development finance, and but more importantly, also seen from the geopolitical dimension, a way of soft balancing, the traditional development partners. And here we're talking about mainly the U.S., former colonial master, Britain, and of course their allies. And then also I should add that increasingly, as China continued to engage within infrastructural terrain, what really endured Kenyan actors is the way the project was delivered. Not only the project was delivered, quite and fast, but also Kenyan policy implementers perhaps were more interested in terms of how Chinese contractors, Chinese workers were able to gradually adjust with the local context, unlike, where Western companies and Western expatriates will in a way appear to just stay in a kind of an ivory tower sort of environment. And so the Chinese really, rather Kenyans really found a Chinese mode of delivery quite attractive, easy to work with, and a bit, adjusting. And finally, in terms of now, also a few of Chinese actors who had already established their farms in Kenya had formed some.
The pregnant pause there. There we are.
Of informal alliance, started showing more interest. The informal alliance sort of, worked together with the, Chinese entrepreneurs, Kenyan businessmen, Kenyan politicians. And so we had some kind of elite interest, which, worked parallel to the formal structure of government. And so increasingly we have now seen this engagement taking more broader engagement in terms of the scope of the infrastructure project. We are seeing now mega infrastructure like what you have seen in the video we've just shared, Standard Gauge Railway, which is one of the largest infrastructure projects since Kenya's independence, and financed by Exim Bank.
Great.
Prof?
Thank you, Oscar. Super. If I can ask Alvaro the same question, what was the appeal for Panama of China? What drew the two together, as it were?
Thank you so much, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for this invitation. And just to start with, the more I look at different regions of China interacting with other regions, the more I believe that there are lots of similarities. And I think the China and Latin America case have a lot to add to the discussion in terms of the understanding of China in the global south. China became interested in Panama for a number of reasons, but let me just say one particular one: the Panama Canal. As being one of the most geopolitical choke points in the world, the Panama Canal has always had a very important significance for the US and, of course, now for China. Panama and China did not have diplomatic ties for a long time. In fact, Panama was the most important country for Taiwan up to 2017, when they decided to shift their ties from Taiwan to China. And of course, that became highly controversial in Taipei, but also became a celebratory act in Beijing. And after that, I believe both countries acted for political interest. The president of Panama had enormous ambitions with the establishment of the diplomatic ties. He wanted an FTA, which eventually didn't get through, but he also wanted lots of cooperation agreements. China wanted one specific issue also, apart from having a lot of influence in the canal. They wanted Panama to endorse the Belt Road Initiative. And in fact, Panama became the first country to endorse the BRI in the entire region of Latin America. Right now, we have 19 countries in total who have endorsed the BRI, but Panama was the first one. In fact, if you are interested to ever see one of the actual BRI agreements, which most people talk about them, but they don't see them, the Panama government has published that BRI agreement because of the scandal they had before, the Panama Papers. So now they are legally obliged to publish all the agreements. So the Panama Agreement that you can find online, or you can send me an email, I'll be happy to share it with you, is an actual agreement that you can see in terms of the different points that are highlighted in the agreement. And I can tell you that the MOU is very vague. It doesn't mean much. And I believe from my colleagues in other parts of the world that this MOU is similar to other MOUs that have been signed by other countries in the region, and I believe by other parts around the world. The agreement also included the establishment of ties, included dozens of agreements in terms of security cooperation, which is also seen in Europe, infrastructure projects, and the establishment of free trade zones, which obviously were going to be key for this part of the world. This is important because also this security element has been an important part of the relationship with the US. China is now the second largest user of the canal. And of course, this created a lot of tension with Washington. Mike Pompeo went to Panama in 2018 to warn Panama and other countries in the region not to get too close to China. So for the first time in a long time, we see a reaction by Washington. Oftentimes, Washington doesn't say anything about China and Latin America, mostly because they believe that Latin America is their backyard. So in many ways, we don't see a massive reaction. But putting the Panama case aside, we see that similar pattern in other parts of Latin America. Right now, we have 24 countries out of 33 countries have diplomatic ties with China. And as I said before, 19 of these countries have agreed to endorse the BRI. But what is important and interesting about Latin America in general is that out of the 15 states that recognize Taiwan, 9 of those states, including the Vatican, 9 of those states are located in Latin America. So more than 50% of states that recognize Taiwan are located in Latin America, which is an interesting geopolitical bit of information, because of course that tells us the significance of the region for Taiwan, but also the significance of the region for China. China has been accelerating their cooperation with the region. The first country to establish ties with China was Cuba back in the 1960s, and the relationship has developed quite a bit. They played an important role in China gaining their seat at the UN in 1971. Panama was not one of the countries that voted for China. They were obviously aligning with Taiwan back then. Latin America also played a very important role in China's joining the WTO in 2001. So a number of things have happened around the Panama case. Panama has also allowed other countries in the region, like the Dominican Republic and El Salvador, to switch from Taiwan to China, to the PRC. And that has obviously been very important. And I'm happy to talk more about it at a later point during this meeting.
Great. Thank you very much. If I can ask the same question of Luca. Luca, the appeal of China for Serbia.
Well, it takes two to tango, so to speak. So, I mean, I think that when it comes to both Serbian and the Chinese rationale, they were different types of rationale. I mean, for China, it was simple from the very start. International politics still remains pretty much like a real estate market. Location, location, location. So for them, the Chinese, Serbia became something of a metaphorical door, of a metaphorical bridge in Chinese efforts to try to win and connect themselves with European markets. And how did Serbia qualify itself for the Chinese? In geographical terms and in legal terms. Geographical terms, you only have to take a look at the line, where do the key points of connectivity goes from Europe to Eurasia, and almost always the Balkans are going to find themselves on your radar. And of course, Serbia being the geographical heart of the region was an unavoidable piece of the puzzle. And number two, I also think that what qualified Serbia for the Chinese to be their door towards Europe is Serbia's status as an EU membership candidate. So it was very convenient for China because they realized that Serbia is not an EU member state, so it does not have the same type of legal screening mechanism that an EU country has. But at the same time, it did apply that Serbia does have institutional, political, commercial, and all other types of ties with the European Union. So that means Serbia was a very convenient laboratory to test, so that the Chinese can test how far they can go in their attempts to penetrate the European markets. And as far as the Serbian side of the equation, the Serbian half of the equation goes, I think it has to do with the fact that Serbian foreign policy still operates in a world which was born in that fateful year 2008. For Serbia, those two key events, transformative events, I think, number one were the independence of Kosovo, and number two were the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis, I think, and it became even worse later on with subsequent crises, with the migrant crisis, with Brexit and everything else. It became obvious from that moment in time that what was at that moment in time the dominant foreign policy issue on Serbian agenda, which was EU membership, that wasn't going to happen, or at least not going to happen in an easy or quick way. So China was sort of a type of way for Belgrade to hedge its bets, to compensate for the lack of EU enlargement, to perhaps not replace the European Union, but simply to patch some wounds, to diversify its partnerships and find alternative sources of cash. That didn't start right away. It took some time, but we now are definitely seeing a process where China has emerged as Serbia's primary partner outside the Western world, and we are seeing this based on the example that Chinese foreign minister is visiting Belgrade today as we speak. So now I will leave it to Luca to give his perspective on this issue.
Thank you, Vuk. Well, I can mostly echo what my colleague Vuk has outlined as the main reasons for for Chinese influence growing in Serbia and in the Balkans in large. So I think there are two dimensions, main dimensions, one being the economic, of course. China is the sort of a piggy bank for this sort of large-scale systemic projects, such as the infrastructure projects that are mostly either non-profitable immediately or only in the long term and only under specific conditions. Because China, even if a certain project is not profitable immediately, or one of these projects, it doesn't matter much because for China, the main goal is this mega project of one belt, one road. Thank you, one belt, one road project. So in that sense, if this particular one project of large scale for the particular country in the region does not pay off immediately for China, it can pay off in the long term because it provides the political influence for China and the security that the project as a whole will have a benefit in the end. The second thing is political influence. And for Serbia, of course, as every government, this government has every reason to try to persuade the public opinion that they're providing for this golden age, as they say. So they're providing for new profitable investments from abroad. And China is a perfect collaborator for this. They can example how their special ties with the Chinese government and Chinese companies is helping this. But on the other hand, I think what is specific for Serbia, because of this, its geopolitical surroundings, it's that China is playing the role that Russia had for a long time, which is the balancing act with the West. So Serbia knows that the West is most of the pressures when it comes to the political implication of this very present democratic backsliding in Serbia. If the West would criticize it, they have to have a backstory, let's say, the other actor that they can turn to. For a long time it was Russia, and it is still to a certain extent, but China, being the growing influence in the region, is a much better actor to play this role. And also it has a bit of a balancing act towards Russia as well, to say to the Moscow, you're not the only one who we can turn to in the East in case we need some kind of a support when it comes to the pressures from the West.
Excellent. So we get a sense across the board. There are a variety of motivations here, but it sounds to me that what we see is the appeal of an alternative. That alternative could be represented as geopolitical. It could be represented as development finance. It could be represented in very particular project ways or elite interests or what have you. But in all respects, it represents an alternative, and that draws states closer or begins the process of that. If I could ask Oscar then a follow-up question and again go through our group. Oscar, if you could talk about, you mentioned and the video demonstrated there was the key project, the development finance project of the Kenyan standard gauge railway. And I wonder if you could speak to how it was, the aspirations and the implementation and how Kenya experienced that. Oscar, are you there?
The microphone, I think.
The microphone, you need to unmute, Oscar.
Oscar, could you, I think I think it's on mute. Is that possible?
Yes, I'm back. Thank you.
Okay,
thank you.
Good.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you. I was struggling to get what I refer to as a cocktail of infrastructure project that Chinese government has extended to the government of Kenya. And the reason why I was interested in this graphics is for the participant to get an idea of the extent of China's engagement in Kenya's infrastructure. Obviously, we have, rather obviously, SGR has been cited as a mega project, but suffice to say, that there are other, subsectors that China has engaged in. Of course, China has built a number of road projects and mainly bypass projects around the city of Nairobi. China has also, extended a financial support in the energy sector and of course social sectors like education and health. But now turning to the mega project, as advised by our moderator, Professor Chris Alden, in terms of the conception of SGR, as you
SGR being standard gauge railway, just so it's an acronym, so they know the acronym. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. Standard gauge railway. That is Kenya-led standard gauge railway, as you say in the video. The conceptualization, initially seen as a project that will link Kenya's coastal city of Mombasa to Great Lake region in Africa, and this covering landlocked countries, Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, and a connectivity in South Sudan. So mainly the idea here was to enhance regional connectivity, and it is, and the development of the implementation of that development was actually hinged on infrastructural advancement on the Kenyan side. So if Kenyan side were to build the first phase as it was completed from Mombasa to Nairobi, and then from that was phase one. Then from Nairobi to the northwest of Nairobi to a town called Narok, that is phase two. And then from that part to the western part of the country called Kisumu, that is phase three. Now, if Chinese government, if Exim Bank was satisfied that implementation progress on Kenyan side was satisfactory, that will actually put it in a better footing to extend the next phase of it on the Ugandan side. But as you are aware, of course, in terms of risk management, Exim Bank did risk management assessment in terms of economic viability of the project, seeing from the perspective of will cargo transport from the port to Nairobi be adequate enough, and what are other challenges that accompanied that transportation of cargo. Obviously, there was competition between road users and rail, and that also fed into the whole risk assessment. And in a sense, then Exim Bank was not in a position to offer positive assessment about the viability of the whole project. And so it stopped to extend additional project, pulled the whole thing into some kind of now again regional bargaining push and pull in terms of will really the neighboring country Uganda, Rwanda, will they be interested in terms of the whole project? And of course, Rwanda, which was a key partner in the whole project, sensing that Exim has already, issued such a advisory indicator against the economic, its initial decision and went for the Tanzanian route, and of course that will also have implication on the geopolitics within East African region. And therefore, what we are having at the moment is that, as initially conceived, the standard gauge railway has actually stalled in the middle, if I will use that word, stalled in the middle. And what we are having is it gets into that town that I mentioned called Narok, and then now it reverses to the old meter gauge that then extends to the neighboring country. All that has rendered observers to ask the question about Kenya's expected benefit from the implementation of the SGR. And obviously, we start now doing the analysis of the whole question about debt sustainability and other accompanying concerns. For example, as I will be talking about later on in my presentation about environmental concern. There are also questions to do with, for example, as it was stated in the presentation, the Chinese actors who did actual implementation. There wasn't meaningful, transfer of knowledge and skill, and so the question is, how will maintenance of this infrastructure, the completed railway line from Mombasa to Narok, go about once Chinese have gone? So these are the dynamics that we analysts, we scholars are interested in terms of analyzing, and this forum actually present an ample opportunity to try to explore these dynamics as we will proceed, in subsequent engagement. Back to Prof.
Great, thank you very much. So we lost you a little bit in part of it. Just to summarize the key points, that they did stall the railway. Exim Bank did not provide the next installment because they felt the question, there was concerns about the commercial viability of the project, and that this inspired, there were other routes that were being developed around the region, which also had an impact on this. So it was stopped for some time as a growth project, but reinstated. We'll come back to you. Alvaro Mendez, if we can ask you a bit about the project, any key projects, infrastructure or otherwise, the aims and the outcomes as you experience them, or not, as Panama experienced them.
Just thank you, Chris, and thank you, Oscar, for what you're saying. The more I hear you, the more I see more similarities between the different regions of the world. And I think that is very interesting, and we should take note of that because we don't have enough comparative studies. Panama, in many ways, as a case study, is complicated. You can see a massive gap between the intentions and statements of China at the very beginning and the actual actions. Partly because, unlike some of the countries that are being presented here, diplomatic ties were only established in 2017. So this is a very brand new relationship. And as I mentioned before, on the side of China, it was established for geopolitical reasons. And on the side of Panama, I think more political elite reasons. China has realized very quickly that they might have the ability to powerfully influence different governments, but that governments change very quickly. And this has been the case of Panama. When the diplomatic ties were established in 2017, there were 49 agreements signed, very ambitious, and that included trade, included security, education, infrastructure, and so on. All the different key elements that China likes to put in their intentions and statements, and also the BRI agreement. And having established these agreements, what has happened is very little in actuality. One of the important agreements that they signed was to build a railroad connecting Panama City to the border of Costa Rica. In many ways, a lot of these projects have in mind the idea of connectivity that the BRI has in mind as one of the most important variables, and also the connectivity elements that you see with the AIB. So that was one project that has not been completed, and I'm not sure if it will be completed, and I will tell you the reason why in a few minutes. And this was a 5.5 billion project for that particular train. Of course, the idea was that this was going to be paid by the government, probably with aid from China, but also built by Chinese companies. They also promised a third set of locks in the Panama Canal. If you understand anything about the Panama Canal, you need locks because it is not at the sea level, unlike the Suez Canal. It depends on water. So the whole infrastructure could be affected by climate change. China promised to help with a set of third locks, and I think that has come through a little bit, but it has not been completely financed by China. The Panamanian government and other governments that actually use the Panama Canal strategically have put some funds for that. Also, China stated that they were going to build a cruise port for cruise ships. And the rationale for that, I still don't understand, because there is very little tourism going from China to Latin America. So it was important for Panama. Panama likes to hear that people are going to be coming to visit. And of course, that was always a very positive reason for the Varela administration. They awarded other projects. Important here to say that Hawaii, for example, has their headquarters in Panama to operate in the region. But the problem here is that the government changed in 2019. So when Varela came to government in 2017, he had a very specific reason to advance his the relationship of Panama with China. He wanted an FTA at the end of his term. In fact, he pushed quite a bit for this, but it was not achieved. For Latin American leaders, having an FTA is the equivalent for anyone else to have a PhD. It is the ultimate goal that you can achieve and you can leave the presidency with. You get a kind of diploma with an FTA, and that's kind of the goal of Varela, but it was not achieved. And then with the new government coming in 2019, everything was put on hold. In fact, the current government has been very ambiguous about the relationship with China. They have done so to shift to the US a little bit. The problem is that Washington could care less. In fact, this is a massive problem in the region. The US is not very attentive to the needs of the region. It has never been attentive to the needs of the region. So China only has to be marginally better to be accepted by the region. So many things are on hold. We'll see what happens. I believe that the current government will eventually restart some of these projects because no one else is there to help. But of course, we were caught also in the same time as the COVID crisis in 2019, 2020. And of course, that has had major implications, so much that no funds from China came to Latin America as a whole in 2020. Not a single penny came from the policy banks. The only money coming from China in a sort of way was a project financed by the AIB in Ecuador in December 2020, only for $50 million. So we'll see what happens now that perhaps things will go back to normal. But interestingly to say, and I will end with this note, countries in Latin America were in a massive crisis, like a lot of the regions in the world, but with COVID-19, and they didn't have vaccines. Panama, of all cases, actually, was one of the countries that has used the least amount of vaccines from China, which tells you in many ways where the relationships with the relationships at the moment.
Thank you very much. Look.
Well, as far as some of the key projects, Chinese projects in this country goes, I think that for years, and I believe that still remains the case, this is probably the signature project of not just Chinese presence in Serbia, but of 17+1 initiative. Okay, now it's 16+1 as Lithuania departed the initiative, but it remains the Belgrade-Budapest railway. I mean, this project has been troublesome from the start, but most of the time not because of the Serbian side of the equation, but because of the Hungarian side of the equation, where the EU frequently would freeze and block this project because of the transparency and bidding standard concerns. Now, recently we had the Serbian and Hungarian government announcing that this project will be implemented, but let us also not forget that there is also a major battle in Hungary on this issue where the Hungarian courts ordered the papers and contracts surrounding this railway project to be released by Viktor Orban's government. So we can expect more legal and political tussle there, so I would still remain some degree of vigilance and reservations on whether this project will be implemented and finalized that quickly. But we have seen, what we are seeing in Serbia is actually the key. I think that's the major point, is that China has taken over the old industrial facilities which originate from the days of former Yugoslavia, and yes, which are dirty, outdated technologies, but sadly that provide livelihood to the Serbian families. And that has been a major point because China was the only one who was willing to buy them, the only one who was willing to invest in them, and the only one who was willing to take over them. And that meant a lot for the Serbian political leadership, because it meant that certain families in certain communities, the two investments that I'm talking about is steel mill in Smederevo, which is taken over by Chinese conglomerate Hestil. And I'm also talking about RTB Bor, the copper mining complex in the city of Bor, which was taken over by the mining company Zijin. And they have taken it over. I mean, there is a cost. We see a degradation of the local rule of law. We see the degradation in the environmental standards. However, it still provides salaries and puts foods to the table. And in the end, it also brings votes to the Serbian government. So this makes it a necessity. And more importantly, I think that now we are also seeing not just that China is taking over old facilities, but it also has greenfield investments where it starts from scratch. And probably the biggest greenfield investment in the country right now is the tire factory, which is being built in the city of Zrenjanin. However, if you talk with local social activists there, you will also encounter the same set of problems related to how the Chinese are behaving there and about the environmental standards. However, this is, from the standpoint of the Serbian leadership, this is a trade-off that they are willing to make. And I think that in the age of COVID-19, China has become extremely important for the Serbian leadership, both as an easy source of cash to keep the economy afloat and at the same time as a tool of domestic promotion, which is, I think, essential right now as we will be having presidential elections in a couple of months' time.
Yeah, well, I mean, Vuk has mentioned most of the strategically important project that China was involved in. There's also two other corridors, Corridor 11 that they were building, and also Fruškogorski corridor that they're about to start constructing at the moment as we speak. Also some other investments, and you can see that most of these investments they're all actually strategically important, and they're all very visible. And this is important for two reasons. The strategic importance of these projects is actually how the Chinese government is actually building its political influence over the government in Serbia, of course. And the visibility and in these projects, especially because most of them are, I mean, it's very easy to see how it benefits the country if you have a new road or if you have saved some of these industrial facilities that are really of strategic importance for Serbia. This helps China build its own image in Serbian society. So you can see now, like we're doing these public polls every year, and China in recent 2 or 3 years has jumped up to the second place just after Russia as the most popular foreign actor in Serbia, which, I mean, part of it is, of course, because of the governmental promotion of Chinese investment, but also, of course, because of these investments as big as they are. But what I would also like to emphasize is usually people talk about how Chinese projects are appealing because there's no political conditionality as there is when it comes to the Western investments. I don't think it's true. I think there are different type of conditionality, very, very particular ones. The first one being when you have projects being implemented and financed by the Chinese loans, you always have, or almost always have, Chinese companies who are coming and also Chinese workers who are coming with them to implement these projects in the country. Second, very often the agreements are non-transparent, and that gives way to Chinese investments to avoid certain regulatory constraints that they would have if there was some other country who would implement these projects which would follow these legislations. And I think it's really important because when you have, for example, when you don't have to put filters on your factories, or when you can bring 1,000 workers from China who would work in unhuman conditions here, that all of a sudden lifts up the profitability of the investment as well. And the third one, of course, is the influence that China is having, like direct political influence that China is having on foreign policy of the countries such as Serbia, where you can see that Serbia is, for its own interest, but also for some other reasons, supporting Chinese position on the most pressing issue of China, such as the Hong Kong issue, the Uyghurs issue, etc., etc. So these are the political conditionalities that actually China is bringing with them, and of course also, as Vuk has mentioned, the environmental damage, which is tremendous in these cities, etc., etc. So there's a cost-benefit equation there that needs to be followed.
It's interesting what you're saying, because I think that there are parallels across here. One of them is the socioeconomic trade-offs that are involved in taking non-conditional loans or low conditional loans. Part of them can be, again, I'm speaking in generalities, I'm drawing from the different regionals here, but there are environmental consequences by dispensing with or using only a rudimentary feasibility study when it comes to provisions for loans. You set up a situation where communities are at the forefront, feeling the heat. They get employment on the one hand, but they also may lose in other areas. So it's that sort of trade-off that is represented, I think, across regions in all cases. Another one that I think is interesting is elections. You were talking about, I think that the Kenyan, Uhuru Kenyatta, am I right, Oscar, that the Kenyatta announced the standard gauge railway as a great project, the largest loan and infrastructure project since independence, on the eve of a highly contested election, which he did indeed win. It was a development. It enabled him to position himself as a giver of development to a society, a cynical society. Is that right?
Yes, Prof, you're right. I mean, this project was, was presented as some kind of, a messiah, a kind of an alternative to the colonial, railway project. And so it came even at a time where then, Uhuru Kenyatta was facing accusation against, by international court, and he presented a narrative that we are going to put in place a mega infrastructure project that will see Kenya now forget about old colonialist mindset, infrastructural mindset, and so when he came into power, he fast-tracked everything, seeing to it that this project was actually completed within 60 months and just a few months to, his re-election bid. And so, right as you have said, it was seen as, he presented this project as a giver of development initiative.
And then, Alvaro, on the socio-economic and environmental impacts, if you think maybe outside of Panama to Peru or some of the other countries I know you've done work in, do you see similar sorts of phenomena, say in the mining sector or what have you?
Sure, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we didn't see that much in Panama because, as you know, elections changed the trajectory of things, but I think I was expecting to see that impact. We have seen that massive negative impact in many occasions in the mining sectors, in Peru, for instance, in Chile, also water dams in Ecuador, and many other projects. Of course, the problem with some of the infrastructure in Venezuela, which, as you know, is very, very problematic. Just to say, as you mentioned, one of the main problems here is that governments need funds. So they don't really care what they sign. And the problem on the Chinese side is that the policy banks do not do feasibility studies. In fact, that is a massive problem because they just want to release the funds, they just want to sign the agreement, they just want to have the picture taken, and then the reality is actually very different. I am a big advocate, and that doesn't mean that I endorse everything that the AIB does, but the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has started having some projects in the region. There are 5 countries in total who have gained membership of the AIB. And the reason I am a big believer of the AIB is that the feasibility studies are totally different to the ones performed by the policy banks, precisely because of the membership of countries in Europe and other places around the world. So there are feasibility studies that guarantee a little bit more that the projects are going to have perhaps the longevity and the durability and also the sustainability that we need, especially infrastructure projects need that element of sustainability to be taken into account. And when the projects are simply given to policy banks that in China, that is problematic. One thing that I noticed also is that some of these projects for policy banks within China are actually quite sustainable. So there is an element of misbehavior overseas that has to be corrected, or perhaps the recipient country has to be corrected. I think the key, Chris, is for recipient countries to be more assertive. So far, they haven't been, partly because they don't know enough about where the funds are coming from, but also because they're very short governments. They want to get the money, because oftentimes that money that they get from China helps them politically. I remember President Maduro from Venezuela going to China in the midst of different crises that he has had, coming back to Venezuela, telling them, everyone, that they have plenty of cash from China, when in reality, he wasn't getting any cash, mainly because the Chinese had already given Venezuela $65 billion, a loan that the Venezuelans acquired in order to pay them back with oil. And of course, when the oil prices went down, their debt multiplied massively. So yeah, these are some concerns, and I share with you the issue of feasibility that is not present in some of the Chinese projects.
Thank you. I was also thinking about cross-default problems with the agreements, the non-transparent agreements. There's been a review of 100 different agreements over the last few years, where the idea that risk management for Chinese loans is not just embedded in terms of non-disclosures and a no Paris Club agreements. That is to say, you don't restructure. These loans are not restructured in line with other debtor nations, but also in terms of defaults. If there's a default or there's a problem with one particular, if there's a default on one particular project by a government, that it impacts all the Chinese projects. So when Malaysia went to renegotiate their particular loans, they found this they'd opened up the box of what was behind the loans, and they discovered their hands were really tied. They were stuck with a project which the new government did not want to pursue, but was unable to withdraw without paying a heavy penalty for withdrawing. In any case, we've said lots of things here. We've thrown a lot on the table. I'm going to hold. I know you guys have things to say as well, but let's ask our colleagues out here for questions. Yes.
Thank you for a great discussion. As someone who is coming from Serbia, I will not direct the questions to my dear colleagues from Serbia, but I would like to direct the questions to colleagues from Panama and Kenya. So just for a bit of a context, speaking about the Serbian case, we are often hearing arguments that the Chinese rise was enabled and possible because we are witnessing the stalling in the European integrations, withdrawing of European Union, not proactive presence of United States and other actors, so that there was some kind of a vacuum. And now with the increased presence, we are, let's say that the pushback of the Chinese presence is in majority coming from abroad. Domestic actors are basically unanimous, even from the opposition parties. We are not hearing much criticism pointed towards the rising Chinese presence and the rising level of cooperation. And on top of that, Serbia is someone who is proclaiming to have multi-vector foreign policy, keeping the good relations both with the East and the West. So with that context in mind, and with the clash of the big powers in mind, what is the situation in your countries? Is there a pushback coming from the other actors? Is there some criticism coming from the actors, like maybe United States or some other major player in the field of foreign relations? And what are the main spots or main issues of confrontation, if there is any confrontation coming from those powers? Thank you.
Great. Maybe we could just reverse it for, since it was directed at our two colleagues, and ask Alvaro first and then Oscar second.
Thank you for the very interesting question. Just to clarify, I'm not from Panama. I'm from Colombia. But obviously we are next door neighbors, and that's an interesting case, the case of Latin America. You're asking a very interesting question because domestic groups do not push back that much, actually. In Latin America, oftentimes foreign policy is the domain of the executive and the elites. Therefore, domestic groups are not necessarily involved, partly because there's so much going on internally in these countries that foreign policy is not one of the main priorities. Therefore, what China does very often, they don't target domestic groups, they target the elites, because they know that they have the key to open the gates to anything they want in the region. So that has been an interesting point. The second problem that we have is that we don't have think tanks in the region, so that there is not enough analysts or think tanks or academics pushing back. And that's also problematic. We criticize the engagements, and I think one of the main problems that we see in Latin America is that they're not pushing back, mainly because they don't know enough about China. China knows a lot about Latin American countries, sometimes very specific information. I was in Beijing the other day, 2020, and I met with a group of people who were the Chinese Argentinian Center for Research. I mean, that is the level of specificity that the Chinese have. We don't have that. We need to develop that way more. And another thing that is also very difficult to counteract is that China has a massive lobbying group in Latin America. We call it the China lobby, because that is very important for China, meaning they have locals, former ambassadors to China, former ministers of government, and they use very actively to publicize Chinese projects. And whenever someone says something negative, perhaps about China, they go very much after you, counteracting whatever you say in terms of China as not being accurate or as not being truth. Of course, our role in academia is to mention some of these points that are not accurate, and that includes, for instance, in my case, pointing out the fact that out of the millions of vaccines that were given to Latin America by China, I believe the number is over 300 million. Only 2 million were donated. The rest of the vaccines were sold at sometimes 4 times as much as the AstraZeneca vaccine. So it's also an interesting element. The China lobby has been saying that these vaccines were given for free to the region. So we need to encourage that in society, to have a more pushback by domestic elements, but it is not possible at the moment.
Great, thank you. Oscar, did you want to respond to the question?
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Prof. And thank you, participant, for the wonderful question. And, you know, picking up from what Professor Alvaro has, you know, mentioned in the context of Kenya, you know, pushback is real, I will say so. And this has to be, you know, seen from what one scholar has pointed out as frictional encounters. And these frictional encounters, you know, is seen in terms of engagement between key Kenyan stakeholders and Chinese actors, and to further understand how this frictional encounter occurs at two levels, at the policy formulation and policy implementation of infrastructure project. And let me take a good example of standard gauge railway. The first pushback we witnessed was actually at the, the procurement stage. Obviously, seen from the context of EXIM, a requirement that procurement has to be tied to the Chinese firm. And we have domestic laws that require, open tendering process, requires value for money. And what we then witness is a pushback from interest groups, mainly, Law Society of Kenya, and working together with other groups, challenged that provision of Kenyan law that provide for government-to-government procurement. So that was one aspect of pushback. But still at the same level, SGR formulation came at a time when increasingly Kenya as a fledgling democracy has made huge constitutional advancement in terms of a civil liberty, and the constitution required public participation in terms of citizens being in a position to vet infrastructure projects. So what we had in Kenya was there was no meaningful public participation. Citizens were not given opportunities to vet the conceptualization of standard gauge railway, and therefore there was also a huge pushback from the citizenry in terms of their inability to to engage in vetting the process. But also let me quickly also mention a pushback at the policy implementation. Again, we have to see this pushback in terms of, frustration by citizens in terms of what they expected and what was delivered in actual process. And the whole question about local content, there was, obviously there was some participation of Kenyan workers, but Kenyan workers expected more participation in terms of various job markets, and also the environmental concern that infringed upon environmental various aspects of environment, for example, national encroachment into the national park and other aspects of land, land pollution. And so in all those terrain, we also had, pushback that was crystallized by environmentalist groups. So at various stages of the implementation, be it at policy level, be it at policy formulation, policy implementation, we witnessed pushback, and these pushback actually the ones that have really consolidated negative perception about SGR, as you may be aware. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Other questions from the audience? Yes. Sorry, did you guys want to?
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for a very interesting discussion. My question also goes towards this, the constituencies in favor of China in the various countries. So it was partially already covered by your answers, but I was wondering about two elements. One is the dimension of academia. So we know that China has been investing a lot, especially in Western countries and Confucius Institutes around the world, and basically to a certain extent in trying to steer the narrative. So how does that play out in your various countries, and is that a topic of discussion at all? And secondly, I was wondering about Chinese influence directly in relation to political parties. So there's been a lot of discussion and attempts to map the political parties that are affiliated with Russia in Europe. And much less discussion has been put on Chinese relations with individual political parties so far. As far as I know, I mean, we've been discussing much more about the Belt and Road Initiative and about these strategies, but we can see it at least in Serbia. You can say, I would think that there is quite a strong connection with the ruling party. So again, if you could comment, what are the political actors that represent Chinese interests in your respective geographic areas? Thank you very much.
Great. Let me just add one thing on South Africa. The Chinese government or Chinese sources have played a role in supporting election campaigns for the leading party. So that is in evidence. There are also party training schools and officials to attend those sort of things back in Beijing. So there's been an active training program reaching out to leading parties across Southern Africa and in that way. Let me ask, I think time is running a little bit short, but Oscar, if you had a comment on that, and then we'll go to Alvaro.
Yeah, thank you. On political parties and actors, and of course election, in Kenyan context, there are actually, we witnessed allegation of bribery between Chinese contractors and leading political actors. For example, in the run-up to 2013 election, there was allegation that a Chinese company bribed former Prime Minister close to $5 million, and that was ostensibly to influence the award of tender towards construction of one of the largest referral hospital in the country. Again, still within the political space, at the inceptualization of SGR, one of the Kenyan businessman come politician was involved in the, in terms of conceptualizing the idea. In fact, it has been said, and he has actually confirmed in a recent video, that he played a very important role in terms of conceptualizing that particular project that was later on funded by a Chinese contractor. That particular businessman come politician played a fundamental role in coalition building that brought the current president and his deputy president into a coalition in 2013. Now, once they got into power, increasingly we've seen a Communist Party of China, having a very, a close interaction with the party officials, party officials going to Beijing for training. We have seen those, the Speaker of the Chinese Parliament coming to Kenya, and that kind of exchange at a party level, and so that in a way has also enhanced political engagement between Kenya and Chinese actors. Thank you.
Great, Alvaro. Quick, we have a
very quickly. Just to argue, just to add that Latin America is still in the honeymoon period with China. I mean, although we have had diplomatic ties with China for a long time, the impact that perhaps some countries in Africa and other parts of the world have had with China is relatively new. So the public opinion about it is still quite positive. And of course, China is reinforcing that with soft power techniques held by the Chinese diaspora in the different countries. These friendship associations have been key to prop up the perception of the PRC. Confucius Institutes, as you rightly said, are in pretty much every university. The level of suspicion that we have to of these institutes in the West, in the US and some countries in Europe, is not there. they believe that these institutes are really there just to teach language and not push a political agenda. And the China lobby that I mentioned before, which is composed of academics and diplomats, but other forms, as Oscar said, exchanges. Latin Americans love to travel to China, and the Chinese know that, so they hold a lot of conferences for police, for medical doctors, for students, and that's massively a way of gaining support. Also by building certain things that people find attractive. I call this stadium diplomacy, which is building stadiums. And you have a very good example of stadium being built in Costa Rica after they switched from Taiwan to China in 2007. And interestingly so, recently, Chris and I found that this stadium diplomacy also exists in other parts of the world. They did exactly the same with Djibouti. So it's interesting to say that. On the involvement with parties, I believe China has been very careful about that, more than in other parts of the world. I don't know how long they can keep that. Of course, you see involvement of China with the right and the left, but I think so far they have stayed away from that, and I believe that their pressure is coming from within and with the elites, which are oftentimes the most important actor in general. Thank you.
I know there are other questions out there. We're almost out of time. Do either of you, as local researchers in this area, want to add anything to what has been said? Or?
Well, I mean, I can perhaps build up on Tana's questions about the role of education and the role of political parties in Serbia. I mean, as far as the education channels of influence, soft power toolkits, however you want to call it, I mean, we had Confucius Institutes in the past, and of course we had scholarship programs with Chinese universities, but I can't say that this was a game changer. The thing that I am very curious of seeing how it will develop, how it will transpire, is the collaboration contracts which a couple of Serbian universities have signed with the Chinese university. I even forgot its name. But I think it is very symptomatic that this happened just at the moment when Chinese university was opening up its campus in neighboring Hungary. I mean, and that happened, of course, after Orban expelled the Central European University, which in almost every major field of social sciences is always in top 30 worldwide. So that also tells you something. So we will see whether this will have perhaps negative impacts, like, for example, the case of Chinese Bureau of Oxford University Press, where the Chinese authorities forced the representative office of the Oxford University Press to censor all peer review articles which are critical of China. I mean, you're there at
Cambridge University Press.
I think there was also news of the Oxford, so no one is immune from the CCP, it appears. So, but I think that we will see whether there will be those type of manipulative and negative practices in Serbia. But when it comes to the political parties, I mean, this government is completely China-friendly, because I think that China is being put on the same pedestal as Russia, as old friends from the 1990s who at least didn't bomb us. I mean, the minor coalition party, the Socialist Party of Serbia, I mean, the widow of Slobodan Milosevic famously believed that we can form an alliance with the Chinese during 1990s by opening up Chinatown in Belgrade. I mean, that's the type of mindset that we are talking about here. But I mean, I think that when it comes to the opposition, I think that they are divided. I think that they are very much, they are also attracted to the appeal of having access to the Chinese money. However, I think that there is not a unified stance. The two biggest parties, at least in these opposition blocks, I mean, one is the party led by former mayor of Belgrade, Dragan Đilas, and I mean, frequently some of their representatives ban China very openly, calling the Serbian government a neo-colonial stooge of Beijing and so forth and so forth. While on the other hand, the other party, led by former Serbian Foreign Minister Vuk Jeremić, is very friendly towards China. It was during Mr. Jeremić's mandate as Foreign Minister that the joint statement on strategic partnership was issued. And yes, I can't prove it. I can't prove it, as I said, I won't take it to the court of law. But there are rumors in the political couloirs that Chinese money has been invested in Mr. Jeremić's party. So this tells you something about the differences and discrepancies and different attitudes that the Serbian opposition parties have towards China.
Yeah, just a brief comment maybe also on Ms. Prell's question. When it comes to academia, this is just one of the branches of the soft power strategy that China it's still in the making when it comes to the Balkans, I think. the other being media outlets that's being created, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's still young, but it's going to grow probably. But when it comes to the political parties, I partially agree with what Vuk has said about the opposition parties. Of course, we all know about the special connection that the ruling party has with the Chinese Communist Party. But also when it comes to the opposition, I think most of this critique of China is mostly rhetoric, I would say, and at least when you see the programs, etc., I don't see that any of those parties, if they would come to the power, would neglect the collaboration with China. It's probably going to stay the same way even then. And I think also those who are very much pro-European, I think, except for the smallest ones. So in that sense, I think this is a great example of, usually, as colleague Stefan said, we talk about the vacuum of power, the vacuum of funds maybe from the West that let China in the Balkans. I think it also shows the vacuum of visions for the future. That is the response of this seemingly never-ending EU integration process for the Balkans, and that this has opened up the space that the close collaboration with China is acceptable to pretty much all political actors in the field.
Thank you. I think there's an enormous amount to develop, take further with all of this. We've touched on many points. One thing as well I would like us to take away is the idea that what's China specific in our descriptions here? What are things that states do more generally? How do we understand what China's role is and how it distinguishes itself and how regimes respond to that distinctive feature, the opportunities and/or challenges that it poses there. So on that sort of general summing up comment, thank you very much. Thank you to the speakers from far and near, and we look forward to carrying this debate on in the future.